and the team at Undishirt, which is where we are, to the Arts Council, the Kerry County Council, Kerry Arts, First na Gaeilge, Alian na Gaeltachta, RTE, and our associate sponsor, Dingle Distillery. So thanks to everyone for their help and support. Well, Look, It's a Woman Writer is edited by Éilis Dhuibhne, and it's an essay collection which is written by 21 poets, playwrights and writers who've all contributed to it, and they're reflecting on the feminist literary landscape in the past 50 years in Ireland. So we're joined here today by Éilis Dhuibhne, who's editor, and then Evelyn Conlon, who also contributed to this collection. So Evelyn Conlon is described as one of Ireland's truly major creative writers. She is a novelist, a short story writer, a radio essayist, and a compiler of anthologies. Her work often deals with people who are between places and crossing borders, both real and imagined. And she has been widely anthologized and translated, most recently into Tamil and Chinese. She's a member of the Éilis, and she lives in Dublin. And she has published 4 novels, 4 short story collections, and 4 anthologies. And Éilis Dhuibhne is a former curator at the National Library of Ireland and a fellow and a lecturer in creative writing at UCD and Trinity, as well as being a well-known critic. She writes novels and short stories in English and Irish and has published over 30 books. And her work is also widely translated and anthologized, and she has won many awards. And her novel, my favourite, The Dancer's Dancing, was shortlisted for the Orange Prize for Fiction. And she is also a member of the Éilis. So if you could all put your hands together, I'd like to give them a warm welcome. Now, so the very first question I wanted to ask you both is, how did you come to writing? Because in your essay that you contributed to this, Éilis, you talk about Amy March from Little Women and how she says that talent isn't genius. And she kind of says that to say that not everyone is basically following their dreams of wanting to do something. And I wondered if you could both tell me about your first relationship with writing.
Well, I wanted to be a writer and from childhood, from when I was 8 or 9 and started. I was a great reader, a theme that runs through the anthology actually. Many of the writers say that. And it was, because I liked reading so much, I just wanted to be, I wanted to write my own books and be part of that world. And I have to say, I got every encouragement from the school. I happened to go to the same school as Mia in Dublin, School of Rita. And, this was in the, I guess I started in 1959 or 1960 or so. So this was the dark ages of Ireland, we might think, but and school was very different then from what it is now. But there were no writers in schools or anything like that. But it's still encouraged, yeah. And even more so when I went to secondary school in School Katrina in Eccles Street then. And I just held on to that ambition, and nobody thwarted me. I mean, nobody said you can't be a writer or anything. Yeah. Subsequently, I found out it's curious that there are very few women writers around, but I didn't notice that at the time. Because an interesting thing is, you mentioned Amy March, and of course Jo March. She comes up all the time in this anthology. Is always she does become a writer in Little Women, and she's a heroine for children who want to be writers, I guess. She. The children's books were often written by women like Louisa Alcott and Joanna Speary, Heidi, and all the rest of them. And of course, the most often mentioned writer in this book, Enid Blyton. And the women writers are not in the least bit pretentious. But then, when you go to college or even secondary school, the book I loved most in secondary school was the collection of short stories, Exploring English Part 1, edited by Gus Martin, with all those fantastic stories. And really, only when it was reissued for, I suppose, nostalgic reasons a couple of years ago, I noticed, gosh, there are only 2 women in this book, like Mary Lavin and Catherine Mansfield, represented by what seems to me to be her worst short story, The Fly.
And what about you, Evelyn?
It changes every time I think about that, really, because now I've listened to Eilish, I just realised that's a different, I would answer this differently than the last time we shared a stage, which was up in Bangor. I think I always wanted to be a writer, like from the age of whatever, 7, 8, 9, around about the same age. I can actually remember a day in which I wanted to write a novel. I wanted to be a novelist, although I didn't know what the word meant. As in that I didn't know there was a difference between short stories and novels or whatever. And I was thinking about that recently in an aside story when an old woman in Clare was saying to me about the priest. She had confessed to a sexual sin, and the priest asked her, had she taken pleasure from it? And she said to me, we didn't know what pleasure was. And I was thinking, was it that she was talking about they didn't know what pleasure of the thing was, or that she didn't know what the word meant? So I'm going back to that. I didn't know what the word novel meant, but I still wanted to write one. But I wrote an essay. I had one teacher, Bridge Doherty. I was in St. Louis in Monaghan, and I wrote an essay and won the European Schools Day essay competition. She made me put it in. I'm not a good person at entering competitions. That was sort of, I suppose, interesting. And then I remember writing something about foxgloves. And this is kind of odd. I heard that she had brought this around to different classes and read it out. So I'd say that was my first engagement with the notion. But really, in a way, I'd say I had stories published in New Irish Writing, and I was well on my way to other things before I would have had the nerve to even think of the possibility of calling myself a writer, which is something that happens women much more than it happened men, or certainly then. I'm not so sure that that's the case now.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer, and actually leads me on to my next question, which is in keeping with the theme of the anthology. But I wanted to ask, have you felt that there is a difference being identified as a female writing in Ireland versus a male writing in Ireland?
Well, that's a very deep and difficult question to answer. Okay, what do I think about that? My sense of the whole literary scene now is that, certainly as far as fiction is concerned, that it's an equal playing field. And, you know, the newish writers, some of whom are here, like Sarah Boehm and Claire Keegan, obviously, Sally Rooney, these kind of younger women writers, I don't think they're identified as women writers, and they don't need to be, and you know, I think that it's different now from what it was when we were starting out. Yeah. And I think, you know, revolutions happen slowly. This one has, but I think in a way I fought the battle. It didn't feel like fighting a battle to me, but things change gradually, and we were part of that change, and now that's kind of even. But I think certainly, when I started, there's no question. Not when I was in school, or even when I started publishing my stories, like in New Irish Writing with David Marcus in the 1970s. I wasn't really conscious of the woman writer thing at all. But by the time I was writing my first book, absolutely, because in fact, when I got my first book together, a collection of short stories that had been written over about 10 years, the first publisher I came to was here in Dingle, Brandon Press. I went down, I carried them down to Steve McDonough. I might describe this in the essay. I thought I had a baby hanging out of me and my book in my arm. I thought I was great. And Steve...
Wearing red corduroy,
that's something, that was the sling, yeah. So Steve, the sling was, everyone had a baby in a sling if they had a baby. So Steve actually said this. He said he'd published the stories, but he said, I'm really surprised that you came to me because all the women are going to Attic Press and the women's presses, and in the end he didn't publish the book. He kept it for a year and then pleaded financial difficulties, which they were always in, I think. And then I ran off to Attic Press and got it published. And you know, when I wrote my first novel, The Bray House, which is a futuristic kind of science fiction-y sort of novel, I remember being interviewed by Mike. You know, on the arts show.
Mike Murphy.
Mike Murphy, yeah, kind of great person, big booming voice. Now, Éilis, you've written this book for women and about women. Come on, this is a science fiction novel about nuclear holocaust in Ireland or something. And but you were pigeonholed. Yeah, you were pigeonholed. It's not happening now, though. I don't think. No.
Yeah, and have you found the same, Evelyn?
I think being a writer for anybody is difficult. At any time. There's a huge thing of you're the person who has decided to do it, and this doesn't matter what gender you are, and you're doing it against yourself, and it's a very solitary and a very difficult thing at times because you have to make yourself do it, and you know where you're aiming and nobody else does, and they have to live with you in the meantime or interact with you, and you have to do this, and yet at the same time you're still doing that. So that's the same for men as for women. Certainly when I was starting, without a doubt, if there had been no Ireland House and no Attic Press, there are many women who would not have been published in Ireland. And what's more, I think that the revolution, if that's what we want to call it, that is there now, in which the level playing field has been kind of reached, it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for Attic Press and Ireland House, simply because, without a doubt, the editors in places were saying, no, I'm not going to touch that. Now, I would have had a slightly different experience to Éilis, because although I had had 2 short stories published when I was quite young, one of them was written when I was about 16 or 17 and one a few years after that. But then, because of the issues that I was writing about, or the characters that were in my stories, most definitely there was, we will not publish that. And it includes, unfortunately, the aforementioned David Marcus, which I hate talking about. I still hate talking about it, because he just absolutely could not stand the idea of what I was writing about and how I could possibly think that this would be acceptable, and also how I would have imagined it. I hadn't even imagined it. There you go. So I would have certainly had quite a difficult time. And I would say that that has still affected my work in many ways. I mean, of course I have ignored it, and of course I have got on with my work. But quite often I think the gatekeepers who were there then have metamorphosed into another kind of gatekeeper. Yeah. And I think, for instance, so you're asking the question about men and women. Anyway, I don't really like talking about my own thing, really, because in a way, you know, I just kept at it. But unfortunately, there would be people who didn't. That also includes some men. Mm-hmm. But there would certainly have been a lot of women who didn't keep at it. But one of the things I think, the difference, I suppose, is, you know, what's going on at the moment now in the context of some writers are huge PR stuff, like ludicrous PR stuff, to the point where when you pick up the book and it's just a book, you're actually disappointed because you thought it was going to, I don't know, what it was going to do to you. So that is happening for 1, 2, or 3 people, and then the other people. And all of this is part of our culture, and yet, in fact, we're not seeing the voices. So the other voices. So in a way, it's still the same thing, except that it's for different people. Because if you take, for instance, the male poet, if you were a male poet at the time of Seamus Heaney, your life as a writer will have been affected. There's no doubt about it. Simply because it suits, it's easier to concentrate just on one or two or whatever, rather than on what is, in effect, the voice from their culture. I mean, I see our job as writers, or our job, or our lives, as being within Ireland at the time that we live in, although I'm also part of the world and I've lived other places and I've written about other places a lot, but I see it as part of an overall culture that is both literature, music, painting, all of that. And when we concentrate only on what they say are the chosen or the designated few, we dismiss ourselves as people. I think we need to be continuously saying more than the few voices that the PR machine has decided to deal with. And that's probably actually worse now than it was when we were beginning.
I think that's something I actually loved about reading this anthology, though, was that there are 21 contributors in it, and I discovered new writers while I was reading through it, and then I went and researched them, and then I got books out of the library. And I wondered because also I should say that this anthology is published by the eponymous Ireland House, who we've been speaking about, which I think is quite symbolic in our conversation. But what prompted you, Éilis, to want to compile this anthology?
Well, I have always felt that I was born at a lucky time for a female who had literary ambitions or interests, and that because I was born in 1954, all the birthdays are available in this book, so 21 women whose age you will now know. Some of them I didn't know before, but anyway. And the reason is that even though that was a dark time for Irish women, and as we know, and Irish writing as well, the days of censorship, etc., by the time I was 20, the whole scene was changing. Gender equality was happening, in life in general. And in literature as well. There was no. I'm pretty sure there was little talk about gender equality in my mother's day in the 1950s. She had to give up work, even though she wasn't working in the civil service. Once she got married, no work, no job. I'm not sure what that was all about. But all that sort of thing was changing. Contraception was obviously not legally available in Ireland in the 1970s, but it exists and it's becoming available, and so on and so forth. Legislation is changing and the literary scene is changing, so that it was a good time. And I feel I always felt, gosh, I'm so lucky, I belong to this group or school of writers who were born in the mid-20th century in Ireland, and for whom the timing was right and lucky. And I can tell my story, but I think they should all be telling their story, and they're all, they're nuanced, they're not all the same, but they certainly have in common that they started writing and that they're still writing. Like, they're all in their 60s and in their 70s. There are two others here, actually, in the book, Enid Blyton and Mary Rose Callahan in the audience, and they're still writing. They haven't given up, and they've kept on publishing over 30 or 40, 50 years. Yeah. So I feel this is one of the big revolutions in Irish literary history, really the most significant one maybe since Yeats and the Celtic Revival and the Aviocan and everything, that the women's writing question is one of the huge big changes. And we were there, writing it, part of it. So I wanted that to be documented. And there are 21 writers. I don't know how many more there are out there from the same demographic I don't know if there's another 20, but I'd say there's another 21. There's room for more of these stories, and I do hope that they get told, just to, tell it from the horse's mouth, what it was like, what happened, the question you asked at the beginning, when did you start? My idea is that there have always been girls who started writing when they were 8 or 9 years old and who thought, I'd love to be a writer. And I'd say they gave up more, but I think we belong to the generation where, well, if you had a bit of luck and so on and you got published, because that really is key to keeping going, that we were the ones who kept going,
Yeah. And the title of the book actually comes from your essay in it, Evelyn. How did you come up with that title, I wondered?
The same as Norman. I haven't a clue.
It's actually, that was a line in Evelyn's essay, and I said, Evelyn, why don't you call your essay this? It was called something like Why I Became a Writer. I forget what it used to be called, and you do too, obviously. Yeah. But so I called the essay Lucas Woman Writer, and then, like many books, it was finding the title. It had various titles, and I thought, why don't we call the book that? And I circulated it to some of the other contributors, and they said, yeah, that's a great title, let's go with that. So Evelyn has a great way with the words. I mean, for the pithy phrase is one of the one-liners. You're very good at the one-liners. So in this case, it kind of came from Evelyn and migrated to the title of the book, yeah. And it's ironically meant in your essay, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it still is. But,
who does she think she is? I'm just thinking when Eilish was talking there, I edited with Hans Christian Oeser, done by Brandon. Done by New Island. Cutting the Night in Two, which was a collection of short stories by Irish women writers. And I only wanted it by people who had actually done a collection of short stories rather than novelists who'd written the odd one. And I was astounded by that. I was astounded by what I learned and who writers I found. And what I found interesting was that years and years later, that when Sinead Gleeson was doing her... The Art of the Glimpse. The Art of the Glimpse. No, the other one, the first one.
The Long Gaze Back.
The Long Gaze Back. She talks about the fact that Cutting the Night in Two, she had been astounded by that as a young woman. She had found this book and she had simply not known that there could be such an anthology of Irish women. So for me, a lot of times, and then we'll come back to, because you'd also been talking about that thing about, Waking the Feminist, which was the reaction to the fellows in the Abbey deciding to put on all plays by men. I mean, unbelievable, but I mean, it happens, it still happens. You'll go to events and without them even thinking, every single writer they mention will be a man. And, it's just too embarrassing at this stage, I ignore it. But, it still happens. But there was a very interesting thing because a number of people got on the stage at the Abbey and they spoke about what their reaction was and how they felt about it. And Eleanor Metzen, who would have been, some of you would know her name. Sorry if I'm squinting a lot. It's the lights are in my eyes. It's a bit, but I can kind of see it. But she mentioned that she had been involved with Sharabank Theatre, which was a theatre in Belfast, which was very feminist orientated and was a great theatre. And she mentioned that she hadn't been asleep. Now that was actually what I was feeling as well. I was sitting there and I was thinking, excuse me, hold on a minute here. I'm not sort of going around saying, I have worn the shoes off my feet at demonstrations, which I have actually, but I wasn't actually thinking that. I was just, ruminating and thinking and bringing myself back to an experience that I had. When I left Ireland when I went over to Australia on ship when I was about 19, and we won't go into all this, and I stayed there for a while and I came back over by bus across Asia and came back to Ireland. And I had a child. I came back to finish my degree and have a child. I was very young. And then I was going to leave Ireland again or whatever. Anyway, this is not what happened in my life. So I had one child, and I went to university, and I started the creche in Maynooth with the first child. I got pregnant. I had a second child in second year, and I separated from my ex-husband in third year. So it was a busy few years. So the original story that was to happen didn't happen, you know. So maybe in a way that is the background to where my work came from as well. When I stayed here, my work might have been very different if I had actually managed to flee the island. I stayed and probably resented it for a number of years. But I'd say about 7 or 8 years into it, I suddenly realised it might have been the only favour that my ex-husband had ever done me, to make me sit here in Ireland, because it's a better place to have been. But that's an aside. When I was doing my degree in Maynooth, and I was doing sociology, and we had to do a mini thesis, I think it was in third year, and I wanted to do continuities and discontinuities in the women's movement in Ireland in the 20th century. Now, I wanted to include the ICA, the Women's Social and Progressive League, any of the women, and there were some radical women in the Irish Housewives Association, and I also wanted to, and then of course Irish Women United, the Irish Women's Liberation Movement and Irish Women United, and the more radical I was, the more they were going to get space in my essay, there's no doubt about that. But I was also going to make sure that the ICA, anyway, got there, because there were quite interesting women, really interesting women working with them. So I presented this anyway, and to me, they just scoffed. That's not sociology. I had to fight to get the essay accepted as a mini thesis in sociology. And I mean, you could do, I mean, how amazing. Now, this is 1977, I think, 77, around about that, or maybe 78, something like that. But when I went, so they accepted it in the end, and when I went to do it, I had moments of extraordinary joy when I met somebody like Hilda Tweedy and interviewed her, and a few other women in particular, whom I was just sort of stunned. I think, God, these Irish women existed. And I was so delighted with myself, and then followed by a massive depression to think that we had not known about it. So on the one hand, it's brilliant, and then on the other hand, you just become so furious that this hasn't been part of not just education for females, but for males as well. Like that. So in a way, I would see Cutting the Night in Two and this book and all those others as ways to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Yeah, that the whole bit is part of who we are.
Completely. And I remember when I read it, because I read it in 2 sittings, I just ate it up. I thought it was brilliant. And I was so interested to read actually all about Ireland House, because I didn't know much about the history. And I felt so proud reading it to think that all of this had come from Ireland, but also sad and angry that I had gone to work in publishing and I never even knew about this. And that was my own fault for not researching it. But that was actually my favourite part in the whole anthology, was the end, and realising kind of the lineage that we were
Ireland House from. And Attic Press and Women's Community Press. And by the way, you know that, and I mean, the sad story about that really is that Roisin Conroy essentially was the person within Attic Press in its end as it was ending, and Roisin got motor neuron disease quite young, and she sold Attic Press to Cork University Press. Now, I have to say, this is the thing that worries me slightly. Cork University Press own everything that's in Attic Press, and that seems to have disappeared down a rabbit hole, which is something that if younger people with a bit of energy who might be beginning in publishing might really, I think, have a look at that.
Good idea. I could keep going. I actually do have about 10 more questions written down, but I want to open it up to you guys. If anyone in the audience has any questions, we have about 7 minutes left. So if anyone does have a question, if you want to put your hand up. If not, I can keep going with my questions. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? I'll let you all have a think about it for a second then. I had one more question that's really at the top of my mind. I was really struck actually by Anya Glyn's essay in this when she was talking about an experience she had in Dingle in the hospital when she met Peg Sayer's son, who encouraged her to keep writing and also to write in Irish and in English. And I'm really interested in bilingual writing, and when I read The Dancers Dancing, it struck me so much because there's a section in the book where sort of English is rendered in Irish, and it's so fascinating. And I think for me, when I read it, to see these two languages put side by side in the same book meant so much to me. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the space that Irish and English writing has in Ireland. I think we're often lauded so much for our writing in English, but our Irish writing is also so important.
Absolutely, I write in the two languages, so I have, I suppose, a foot in both worlds. But Anya is better able to talk about this, and I mean Anya Glynn, who's now the Children's Laureate for children's literature in Ireland, has written that she's invisible. You're invisible. You're not. We can see you there behind your mask, but she's taken off her. But as an Irish language writer, she's invisible. I mean, we know about Anya here in Dangany Coosh, and in the Irish language circles, and because you're Children's Laureate, you're kind of not so invisible anymore. But yeah, Irish language literature is there in its own kind of little world behind a curtain that is seldom pulled back by the rest of Ireland, and little attention is paid to it. It hardly gets reviewed in the Irish Times, for which I review regularly. So I like the Irish Times, but it's very seldom now that you see a book as Gaeilge getting a review in those pages, or in any really mainstream publication or programme, even Arena, which I also love, and Sean Rocks from Monaghan has a good couple of focal. I mean, he seems to be Agzanit more and Evalis. A Gleifna Nook sounds pretty good to me every time he says it. But Anya, would you like to say something? Is that will we?
I think there is an invisibility about Irish language literature, and I think in my own case I would see a double invisibility, because there are some people who would see me only as an Irish language poet, but when you are writing for children and writing in Irish, it's a niche within a niche, so that you are doubly invisible. And I think a lot of people have, in Ireland, I think a huge number of adults have this ridiculous shame about their Irish, because they're not fluent anymore. They've lost what they had. So it becomes this massive shame, and they're not even prepared to try to read something in Irish that they don't want to know. And yes, I think I've seen a lot of Irish language writers who only became known when they were translated. And it's not that I have anything against being translated. I happened to write mainly in Irish. English was my first language as a very small child, but I had Irish by the time I was 2 or 3. And I moved more and more towards writing in Irish. By my teens, I was writing then totally in Irish. So I don't want to, I think I'm in here to listen to the two of you rather than just talk. But yes, there is an invisibility.
There's an invisibility. I mean, in terms of the gender, Keshin Hinchkina, the gender issue in Irish, I think Irish language literature has also made, there's enormous progress there as far as the women's position, because that was bad and all as English literature in Ireland was. Irish literature in Irish was really awful as far as gender representation was concerned, until relatively recently. And I mean, the number of novels, I think in the 20th century, about a goodly number of novels, Gaeilge, were written, about 300, and of those, about 10 were written by women. It's just extraordinary, That's changed, and the poetry kind of has, I mean, there are a good many women poets, and of course some of the most prominent of the Irish language poets have been women. But still, this poem that some of you will remember, Ban Illa by Sean O'Riordan, he read it at, I think, Donal and Musgree in 1973 or 4 when Anya was writing poetry. I was graduating from university. Inti was there, and Nuala Ní Gheolan must have been starting. Is atlam ban in a fila? She's dum, I paraphrase a bit, Gorgano Firane, Filiac the Haring das Changa. And then he goes on in using the most sexual language to express his fear that if women start writing poetry, they won't want men to impregnate them with children anymore. Like, he makes this leap. And who on earth, who could write that now? Like, you'd be...
They could think it.
That was very interesting. Thank you. Okay, I actually very sadly have to finish up. If we can just put our hands together and say a warm thank you, Eilish Dhuibhne and Evelyn Conlon and Anya Ní Gheolan.